Again. How are we doing, my holy brothers and sisters? Okay. Give the live audience just a minute to tune in. How is it by you? Today I got an offer from the California Earthquake Authority for earthquake insurance. You got to think about insurance. It's always good to be smart, to be prepared, but it's so expensive. It's crazy. Should we get it? Should we invest? Protect against the big one? What do you call it? The deductible is so huge that it only pays in case there's a big one. It's all thinking about the unthinkable. But I guess as we've learned from the COVID crisis, you got to think about the unthinkable. It's just nuts. It's really just nuts. All right. We are live on Facebook, and I see Jerry Weiner in the house, Yehudit Sobel, Joe Branson, James. Great to see you all. And Jenny Weiner, I'm sorry. Did I read that? Oh, Jenny Weiner, I'm so sorry. And she says, I'm a full-blooded Jew from Seattle, Washington. Welcome to the show. And let me just get the YouTube live stream in front of me. Here it is. Fantastic. And I see Deborah Hazelwood is in the house from Florida over there. All right. Let's get on with it. And let me have these comments here. Okay. Melissa Eitel-Jurin is here. Barry Jacobs. Great to have you with us. All right, my holy brothers and sisters. Oh, Mitch Blumenthal in the house. Wow. Tuning in from Florida. And Janice Beanstalk is here as well. Okay. All right, so today we have the strange case of the spiked sandal. What in the world are we talking about? What even is a spiked sandal, and why can't we wear it on Shabbos? So let's back up a step. Where are we? We're holding on page 60, Daf 60, of the second volume of the Talmud, Tractate Shabbos. We're in chapter 6, and today we're opening the second Mishnah. Chapter 6 is about what may a person be wearing, what sorts of things may we wear on Shabbos when we leave the house. The first Mishnah was all about what may a woman wear, the accessories of a woman, and we saw that the primary concern of the rabbis was that if she was wearing a piece of jewelry and she took it off for whatever reason, she might then come to, instead of putting it back on, she might come to carry it in her hand in the public domain and violate that prohibition, which would result in being liable to bring a sin offering. So to protect her from that, the rabbis issued this decree that you couldn't wear that jewelry. Likewise, in the second Mishnah, and we're now going to shift our focus to men's accessories, but we have the same idea. The rabbis are going to issue a decree to prohibit somebody from doing something that might result in violating a Torah prohibition, a biblical prohibition. If you violate a biblical prohibition, you become liable to bring a sin offering as long as there's a holy temple and an altar, and you can bring those sacrifices. Of course, we don't live in such a time, and we haven't in 2,000 years. But what we need to understand is the difference between a rabbinic decree and a biblical prohibition, and it says so in the Mishnah, that you're not allowed to do these things. But if you do them, you're exempt from the sin offering. You don't have to bring the sin offering unless you actually go the second step and violate the biblical prohibition. If you violate the rabbinic decree, okay, so you didn't follow the law that the rabbis set out for you, which was for your own good, to protect you. You should have done that. You should feel guilty about that. You should pray for help that you shouldn't violate rabbinic decrees again, but you don't become liable to bring a sin offering. Okay, today in our Mishnah, we learn that men should not go out with three things. And what are they? the three items that are mentioned for a man is you shouldn't go out on Shabbos. So go outside means leaving the private domain and going out in the public domain, right? Leaving your house, going out on the street. You shouldn't do that while wearing a spiked sandal or a single sandal, meaning a sandal on one foot but not on the other, nor an amulet, which is meant to heal you from a sickness or to ward off evil spirits, etc. But you can wear an amulet, as we've already seen, if it's proven effective. So as we'll learn later in the Gemara, the amulet that's mentioned in today's Mishnah is like an amateur amulet, right? If you're wearing an amulet made by a professional, so then we all have reason to believe that it will be effective, so that you can wear on Shabbos. But if you're wearing an amulet that was made by your Uncle Joe, who never made an amulet before, but said, yeah, this should work, wear this, so then that is not considered effective to bring the benefit that you would want from a professional amulet. And since it's unproven, it's much more similar to a burden that you should not be carrying on Shabbos, and so it's prohibited. That's what we learn in the Mishnah. On today's page, we're mostly going to talk about the spiked sandal. And here, we're actually going to learn that the rabbinic decree that you shouldn't wear the spiked sandal is not because they're afraid that you're going to take off the spiked sandal and show it to your buddy. Hey, look at my spiked sandal, how cool it is. And then because it came off, once you took it off, that you might come to carry it and then be liable to bring a sin offering because you carried in the public domain. In fact, the philosophy behind the spiked sandal is quite different indeed. So first, let's find out how the decree against the spiked sandal came into being. Because in our Gemara, we're actually going to have 3 different histories offered. In other words, by the time the rabbis of the Talmud, the rabbis of the Gemara, are discussing how this decree got codified in the Mishnah hundreds of years earlier, the origin story that led to the decree has become a little bit, lost in the mists of time, or not so much lost as subject to debate, right? So the first theory is offered by Shmuel. Shmuel says the reason that we cannot wear a spiked sandal on Shabbos is because there was an incident. And what happened was there was a time when people were hiding in a cave from religious persecution. Now, who's hiding and why? It's not spelled out. Probably it was a bunch of Jews hiding from some other nation who wanted to kill the Jews. Perhaps it was Jews hiding from Assyrians or Jews hiding from the Greeks in the times of the Hanukkah wars. Or it could also be, for instance, we had the episode when King Ahav, or in English Ahab, whose queen was Jezebel, and they're just pretty much all agree that the most wicked, evil king that Israel ever had was Ahab and his queen Jezebel. Why were they so wicked? They not only brought in idolatrous priests, right, who were building temples to Avodah Zarah, so that they could worship their god, 2 gods, Baal and Ashtaroth, right? So Baal, the Ashtaroth was worshipped around a tree. Baal was worshipped in some other way. The priests of the Baal would cut themselves and do crazy dances, and the priests of the Ashtaroth were actually women priestesses, and they would practice cultic prostitution. At any rate, it was a total evil. There's many prohibitions that are repeated over and over again in the Torah, but God has made it really clear in the Torah that you shouldn't worship other gods, false idols, etc. And certainly you don't establish that in the Holy Land and countenanced by the king and queen. It was a time of terrible wickedness. And the prophets, and at that time, prophecy was something that there were a lot of people, who would actually apprentice to the prophets and sort of go through a prophet education. They would try to, there were people who would indenture themselves. They would become apprentices to the prophets. And it's not that everybody who went through the whole apprentice period automatically received communication directly from God, but prophecy was something that you could pursue and refine yourself and become better and sort of refine your instrument till it become more and more sensitive, and you would be more likely to sort of attract the communication from the divine and then be able to serve your people as a prophet. The point being that there were a lot of prophets at that time and and even more, many more sort of students of prophecy in these prophetic schools. And the whole prophet community was 100% against Ahab and Jezebel and these awful priests of idolatry that they brought in from. Jezebel was not a Hebrew princess. She was brought in. She was the daughter of a neighboring king. And it was one of these like peace treaty type of deals that Ahab married her. But when she came, she tried to bring in her people's practice of idolatry and impose it on the kingdom of Israel. It was a terrible, terrible period, and eventually would come to a climax when the prophet Elijah, challenged these idolatrous priests essentially to a contest. Well, let's see whose God is real. And God, backed up Elijah, and he was able to prove that all of this idolatry is totally false. And it was a great, great episode in history. The point, though, is before that happened, before it came to that place, the prophets who opposed Ahab and Jezebel, sort of spoke publicly against them, became hunted. And many of them were murdered by the king, and especially by the queen's soldiers. And so the ones who survived were hiding in caves. And so it may be that this episode that gave rise to the spiked sandal was from that early First Temple period when the queen's soldiers were hunting down the prophets and they were hiding in caves. I don't know. It just says that people were hiding in a cave from religious persecution. So we have the episode, we have the scene. It's set. There are a bunch of people hiding for their lives in a cave. Shmuel says that what happened was, the rule was, if you enter the cave, you can't leave. Because when you're entering the cave, you can see what's going on outside, and you can tell if anyone is watching, if those soldiers are looking for the people, and it's safe to enter. But when you leave the cave, they didn't have lookouts for that. And by leaving the cave, you might endanger everybody in the cave. So the rule was no one leaves. Unfortunately, according to Shmuel, somebody who was in the cave was wearing sandals that, for whatever reason, left a reverse footprint, perhaps because they were spiked. Spiked means that there's nails in the sole of the sandal. A certain number of them. Almost like spikes, like baseball players wear spikes. So it's these nails in the bottom of the sole that can give it more grip under certain conditions. At any rate, because the footprint that the sandal left seemed backward, a person who walked into the cave left footprints as if it was a person leaving the cave. And when the people in the cave saw those footprints that appeared to indicate that somebody had left the cave, they started to get paranoid and really scared. And in their paranoia, they started to argue and fight with each other. And it just led to, a sort of a chaos inside the cave. And there they were in the cave, hiding from their lives from the dangers outside the cave. But in their fear and panic inside the cave, it's unclear what happened, whether it was a stampede and people got crushed, or maybe they argued so much that some people killed other people. Whatever the case was, they were hiding for their lives in the cave, but people in the cave ended up getting killed without the enemy ever touching them because of the panic caused by these footprints, which seemed to indicate that somebody left when in fact it was somebody entering. That's how Shmuel heard the story. Rabbi Eli ben Elazar said, no, it didn't happen like that. It wasn't that they saw footprints that were reversed and it seemed like, somebody who was actually entering looked like he was leaving. In fact, what it was when they were in the cave, they could hear some sounds from the outside above them. You can imagine the cave is sort of built into a hillside with like a rocky hillside. And somewhere above the cave, they heard people walking around, and those spiked sandals, because they have the nails in the sole, were very loud. And they were associated, these kind of reinforced sandals, they were associated with soldiers, right? So the people in the cave said, oh my God, they found us, right? We can hear people with spiked sandals walking around right above us. They found us, they panicked. Same result as the way Shmuel explained it. In their panic, a bunch of them ended up getting killed. Whether it was the stampede or in their paranoia and fighting with each other, some killed the others, whatever it was that happened, people died in the cave without the enemy actually doing the killing. And Rabbi Rami Bar Yecheskel, he heard it a third way. He said, no, they heard spiked sandals and that caused them to panic, but they weren't in a cave at all. They were actually in a synagogue. They were hiding in a synagogue, again, from religious persecution. They heard somebody with spiked sandals walking around behind the synagogue. That triggered the panic. Maybe it wasn't soldiers at all. Probably wasn't. But it triggered the panic. People died. And so the sages decreed, you cannot wear spiked sandals because of that incident where the person wearing spiked sandals caused a panic among the ones who were hiding, and it led to the deaths of a bunch of holy people, right? So that's the origin of the event. So then the first question we have to ask is, okay, but it's not that the spiked sandals led to a desecration of Shabbos. The spiked sandals led to a loss of life. So if the sages were issuing a decree meant to save lives, so why is it that the Mishnah now says a man may not go out wearing spiked sandals on Shabbos? If the decree is to save life, we would think, no spiked sandals any day, right? Why only Shabbos? Why only Shabbos? And so now we come to understand that the rabbis issued decrees for different reasons, right? In some case, it's to prevent a harm. The harm might be that a person will violate a Torah prohibition and come to be liable for a sin offering. Or the harm may be that people were killed and we want to save life. Or it might be that a decree is created to commemorate an event that needs to be remembered. And that's the case here. It's very unlikely, that people are going to be hiding and are going to be thrown into such a panic that they kill each other or stampede over each other because they hear the sound of spiked sandals outside, right? And that wasn't it. Probably at the time that these guys are writing, spiked sandals is not really a thing anymore. Why do they have the rule? They have the rule so that it will be taught, right? It's more important that the tradition gets transmitted and that people remember that there was a time where in our fear, we were so on edge that we panicked and killed each other without the enemy ever harming us. That's the lesson that the sages want to come down through the generations. There's much less fear that, spiked sandals are going to lead to the panicky stampede. And so they limit the scope of the decree to Shabbos. Why? Because it happened on Shabbos. Because that panic that happened when people were hiding in the cave or in the synagogue, depending on which rendering of the story is accurate, it happened on Shabbos. And so since it happened on Shabbos, they issue the decree on Shabbos. And it actually works, I think, even better. Because if the purpose of the decree is to create a memory in the culture that lasts, and so that people are going to understand that lesson, right? It doesn't really matter whether it happened in a in a cave or in a synagogue, whether the panic was caused by the sound of the spiked sandal or the print in the dirt of the spiked sandal. The lesson is that when we're all in fear, we have to be triple cautious not to panic and turn on each other. Probably a fantastic lesson for our pandemic times, right? In the time of COVID-19, when people are afraid and they so readily turn on each other and can even come to a panic, that is just the behavior we want to avoid, and that the sages wanted people to talk about. They wanted them to learn this law. They wanted it to be taught that you can't wear a spiked sandal on Shabbos because of this incident. What incident? And then we talk about the incident. You might then ask, can you wear the spiked sandal on a festival? We know that you can wear a spiked sandal on weekdays. Oh, it's only on Shabbos that you're not allowed to go out in the spiked sandal. What about on a festival? Answer, no, you cannot wear the spiked sandal on the festival. It didn't happen on a festival, it happened on Shabbos. Why do we extend the decree to the festival? Again, we learn from it, because a festival and Shabbos are exactly the same in every way, except when it comes to food preparation. You can cook food on a festival, you cannot on Shabbos. But in terms of every other law, which pertains to refraining from work, refraining from carrying, not allowing your animals to be burdened, etc., not writing, not dyeing, not farming, not hoeing, not harvesting, etc., all those rules apply the same on Shabbos as on a festival. And so the scope of the decree against the spiked sandal on Shabbos also extended to the festival. So then we have a related incident which the sages raised to compare and contrast. So there was another incident where, and we've talked about this before, the red heifer, right? The very, very, very rare red heifer, a cow that is all one color, kind of that dark auburn color that we would call red for a cow. And they needed a red heifer, not so often. There were only 9 in the history of the kingdom of Israel, right? 9 in 1,200 years. But when they found one, it was a very, very, special event. They would make sure that a yoke was never on it. They would take extreme care of it. They would make sure that it was not rendered unsuitable to be sacrificed by any accident or blemish, etc. And so if they could keep the red heifer in perfect condition until the time that it was offered, so then it would be slaughtered, it would be burned up, and it was the ashes of the red heifer which were necessary in the temple to be added to the waters of purification. Just a few ashes, now and then. That's why this one cow could last for hundreds of years. Its ashes would be stored in a very safe place. Take a few ashes when needed, mix with some, very pure water, and that's the water of purification, which would be used for many, many different things, to purify people that needed to be purified of various kinds of tuma, of ritual impurity. So there was an incident where they found the red heifer. They kept it in a state of purity until it was slaughtered. They burned the red heifer, and then they were transporting the ashes to the place where they needed to be. And these ashes of the red heifer needed, for whatever reason, to cross the Jordan River. So the person with the container of the ashes of the red heifer got into a boat to cross the Jordan River. And after he got out of the boat, they discovered that under his feet in the boat was a source of tuma, a source of ritual impurity. Maybe it was a sharetz, maybe it was some kind of creeping insect, maybe, God forbid, it was the corpse of a human, maybe it was something else, a discharge from a person. There are many things that cause impurity. Bottom line, because the person carrying the ashes was over this source of impurity, the ashes, the extremely valuable ashes of the red heifer, were rendered impure and unusable for their intended purpose. And so they issued a decree, okay, ashes of the red heifer cannot go in a boat across a river. Now, some said, well, to commemorate this incident and to be analogous to the case of the spiked sandal, which, right, people could, be in a cave and be panicked by the sound of a spiked sandal on any day of the week. Why was the decree limited to Shabbos? To commemorate this awful thing that happened. So now, in the case of transporting the ashes of a red heifer, let's just limit the scope of the decree that people cannot transport the ashes of a red heifer in a boat across the Jordan River. Isn't that enough? Answer, no. The sages said, no boat on any river throughout the land of Israel. The scope of the decree was made larger than the details of the original incident. It's not really explained why, in that case, the scope was larger. But I think if we apply our own logical thinking to this question, we'll see, right, the spiked sandal, first of all, it has to do with life and death, not with something that's of high value in the waters of purification. It was a matter of life and death. The circumstances, however, were so unlikely to be repeated that what they wanted to do was to teach a lesson about life and death that, while it might not be repeated in that situation, needed to be learned because it could apply in many situations. The idea of not transporting the ashes of a red heifer was much more practical, right? It's like, we can't do that again, guys, because we could leave a generation without ashes of a red heifer and without the possibility of becoming purified. That object is so valuable that we're just not going to take a chance that it could end up in a boat like that and have this problem. Perhaps boats are, you'd think, well, all they really needed to do is from then on remember to search the boat. But the decree was bigger than that. No transporting the ashes of the red heifer in a boat on any river. And that's the way it was done. Finally, there's some disagreement on what is a spiked sandal. So a spiked sandal, we understand, it's sort of a reinforced sandal. It's one made stronger and associated with the footwear of soldiers, right? It was soldiers who were coming to kill the people that were hiding in the cave or the synagogue, depending on who told the story. So what is a spiked sandal? How many nails need to be in the sole of the sandal for it to, qualify as a spiked sandal? And there's quite a bit of disagreement on that. And it was sort of one of those rules that, depending on who your local authority was, depending on where you lived, and were you in the jurisdiction of Rav or in the jurisdiction of Shmuel, etc., the rule might be a little different. They disagree on how many nails, how many studs in the sole of the sandal would constitute a spiked sandal. And actually, here's a nice illustration of that. There we go. You can see that. Hopefully you can see that. There you go. So it's how many of those studs, those iron studs in the base, in the sole of the sandal would render it a spiked sandal. Because if it's less than a certain number, it's considered more decorative. And also the spikes could be on other parts of the sandal, maybe not just the sole. So, like I said, different rabbis did the math differently. Some said 5. If you have 5 studs, it's decorative. If you have 6, it becomes a spiked sandal. Others said 7. Others said 13. Others said 24. So it's one of those things where you'd have to know the local ordinance on what constitutes a spiked sandal. Interestingly, there's a kind of corollary teaching that if the entire sole was covered in these studs, so that the sole, the actual leather sole of the shoe, of the sandal, would never touch the ground because there were so many studs on the sole, which you would think, well, that's the strongest sandal of all. But no, that is not a spiked sandal, because when you have that many studs in there and the leather never touches the ground, now you've got a different object. It's become sufficiently transformed that this is not what the decree had in mind when it said no spiked sandals. A man may not go outside with a spiked sandal on Shabbos. But in terms of when does a number of studs transform, take it from being decorative to being prohibited, from a decorative ornamented sandal to a prohibited spiked sandal, it's one of the many times in the law, and this is not just Talmudic law, you're going to have this kind of question in the law of the land in any country. Let's say that the speed limit is 70. Okay, so you can go 69. So is a person who's going 70 miles an hour a danger to everybody around them, but the guy who's going 69 miles an hour is not? Why is it that there's always a place where you have a little tiny quantitative difference and it results in a qualitative change? Why? Because it's necessary. Because we have to make definitions. Because we have to write laws that are measurable so that they can be enforced. And of course, that's going to lead to situations that seem to defy equity. Really, the guy who's going 1 mile an hour slower is innocent, and the guy who's 1 mile an hour faster is guilty of a crime. Or the guy with 5 studs in his sandal hasn't violated the rabbinic decree, but the guy with 6 studs has. And the answer is yeah, because people need to know, and you need to make laws that people can follow. But the beauty of it is that if you have a system, at least within a jurisdiction, where people know what the system is, so okay, now the sandal makers know. 5 studs is okay, 6 is not. Or if you're taking your sandal to Pumbedisa, 7 studs is okay, but 8 studs is not, whatever the local jurisdiction is. And it's just a principle that we're going to see over and over again, and it's worth noting that while it sometimes seems silly to measure exact quantities in order to know sort of where the law changes over from one condition to another, the fact is, to make laws make any sense at all, there have to be limits, and therefore the rabbis will spend quite a bit of time defining what those limits are. And we'll see that over and over again in our journey through the Talmud. That's what I've got for us today. Alice Gross says, just boats? I guess you're asking about transferring the ashes of the red heifer. And they said they cannot go in a boat on a river in Israel. They also said, I think you cannot throw the vessel holding the ashes from one bank to another. I think that's what they said. Can I see if I can find that? Where was it? Where's the halacha? The ashes of the red heifer or the water of purification offering may not be transported on any river. It is also prohibited to toss the ashes or the jug of water from one bank to another. So if you think about it, that seems like a simple law, but then if you're going to follow it, that could be really problematic, right? You can't put it on a boat, and you can't toss it across. So how are you going to get it across the river if you need to cross the river? Well, hopefully there's a bridge. What if there's not a bridge? Now you really have to think this through. If there's no bridge, so then I guess you have to find a place where the water is shallow enough that you could walk through the shallow water, or your camel could walk through the shallow water, or something, Or maybe you would think twice, and maybe you don't slaughter the cow on the wrong side of the river. You walk the cow across, and then do it. But then you have to be careful. Are you going to endanger the cow by having it go across the river? If so, then we need a new plan. And you know what? These are the sorts of laws that at first blush oh man, this just makes it impossible. Why are the rabbis being so difficult? But the law is the law. And so it actually leads the person who's in that situation to use their creativity and to find a solution And sometimes experiences come out of those situations that you never would have expected. I mean, the modern example that comes up all the time is I'm an Orthodox Jew. I go traveling. Okay, so I can't eat in any restaurant that doesn't serve kosher food. So now I'm going to be in a really tough situation. I'm in a new city. There's no kosher restaurant. There's no kosher market. I mean, we live in a time now where almost any supermarket has kosher food because so many common foods have a hechsher, but it could still be very difficult. What if it's a small town and all they have is a farmer's market? Okay, so I can buy vegetables, I can buy fruits with some limitations. I can't eat meat, I can't prepare. What's going to happen to me? But because of it, what I might do is I might call my rabbi in LA and say, hey, I'm in, this city over here in the country. Do you know anybody over here? He would say, I don't, but there's a Chabad not far away. Let me call up that Chabad rabbi. He calls him. The rabbi says, oh yeah, I know this guy. He lives over there. You could go have dinner with him. And all of a sudden, you're meeting somebody you never would have met. You have a new friend. You're part of a community you never would have met otherwise. All kinds of blessings flow from following the Torah, especially when it's difficult. And that's a good takeaway for our learning today. Okay. Debbie Miller says, and this will be the last question. So it was prohibited to puncture something with the spikes. That would then be an act of destruction, which would be prohibited on Shabbat. No. The issue wasn't prohibited. It was not puncturing with the spikes. Remember, the reason that the spiked sandal was prohibited was because of this incident that occurred in the past when people panicked because they thought that the sound or the footprint of the spiked sandal indicated that soldiers were coming to kill them. And they lost their minds, panicked, and either fought each other or had a stampede to get out of there, and people died because of that. And so the decree was to remember that incident, and now we can't wear spiked sandals on Shabbat. Not because of the puncturing that the sole might do. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Sal. If the spikes on that shoe, everywhere you go, create holes in the ground with the footprint, isn't that like creating a furrow? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. But generally speaking, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon, right? And so it won't always create a footprint because you might walk on hard ground, sometimes on soft ground. You're not sure what you're walking on. And that footprint, the furrows that it causes, would be the unintended consequence of the permitted activity. The permitted activity is walking. The unintended consequence is creating a furrow in the ground. We're not liable for that unintended consequence as long as we're doing a permitted activity and the unintended consequence is not inevitable, per the ruling of Rabbi Shimon. And as we learned yesterday, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, his disputant, they were both students of Rabbi Akiva. And so it's really a tradition receiving through Akiva and then diffracted or refracted through these guys. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. I hope that this lesson about the importance, the lesson of the spiked sandal, is that when we're in tough, scary times, we got to keep a cool head and not panic at the first sign that something might be wrong and the bad guys are coming to get us, and let that panic allow us to turn on each other. That's today's takeaway. May we all be blessed to remember that lesson if, God forbid, we find ourselves in a dangerous situation. All the best, my holy brothers and